Welcome back to ArkanSense, where we try to make sense of the issues affecting Arkansans. And today, we're going to talk about what's on your 2020 ballot, specifically Ballot Issue 2, titled A Constitutional Amendment to be known as the Arkansas Term Limits Amendment and amending the term limits applicable to members of the General Assembly. But what does Issue 2 actually do? As a quick reminder, Arkansas, just like the United States as a whole, has three branches of government: a judicial, headed by the Supreme Court of Arkansas, the executive, headed up by the governor, and the legislative branch, made up of the Arkansas House of Representatives and the Arkansas Senate. The term General Assembly refers collectively to both the Arkansas House and Senate. Issue 2 would change the limits on how long someone can serve as a member of the General Assembly. Right now, there's a 16-year combined lifetime limit, so someone can either serve 16 total years in just the Senate or just the House, but if they're a state senator at one point and a state representative at another, their combined time can't exceed 16 years, with some special exceptions. And as of right now, there is no resetting that count. Once you hit 16 years total, you're done. Issue 2 would remove those lifetime term limits and replace them with just one rule. Any member of the General Assembly who serves 12 years in a row has to take 4 years off. It doesn't matter if those 12 years were served in the state house, the state senate, or some combination of the two. If the years of service were consecutive, they count. But if a legislator takes a year off before they hit the 12-year total, their count resets to 0 and they can run again. Under both the old rules and the potential new ones, terms that are the result of a special election, like the kind to fill a seat after someone dies or resigns, don't count towards those limits. There is one new thing Amendment 2 would count, though. Members of the Arkansas Senate usually serve 4-year terms, but every 10 years our state redraws its legislative districts, and some senators end up only serving 2-year terms as a result. See our video on redistricting for more info. Under the current rules, anyone who serves one of those extra short Senate terms doesn't count it towards their total. However, if Issue 2 passes, those would count towards the 12-year consecutive limit. Finally, if Issue 2 passes, the new rules take effect next year, so they wouldn't immediately apply to anyone elected in this cycle or before. Those folks would technically still be on the 16-year lifetime limits. Once they hit 16 years, they'd have to take 4 off, and then they'd fall under the new rules. So that's what's on the ballot, but there's an interesting history behind why it's on the ballot. This isn't the first time that Arkansans have argued over term limits. In fact, we've been going back and forth for the better part of 30 years now. Before the 1990s, Arkansas had no General Assembly term limits, but then in '92, voters got a citizen-initiated constitutional amendment on the ballot to limit state senators to 2 terms, 8 years, and state representatives to 3 terms, 6 years. These were lifetime limits, and the amendment passed. Because of this, in 1998, the State House of Representatives saw massive turnover, with over half the membership being replaced. But in 2004, the General Assembly sent an amendment to the ballot to try and loosen these limits to 12 years each. Voters rejected this overwhelmingly, with about 70% voting against it. But just a decade later, in 2014, legislators tried again with a different amendment. Unlike the last one, which had only been about term limits, the 2014 amendment changed a huge number of things. This bill was touted by proponents as strengthening state ethics, but those opposed to it said that the loosening of term limits had been snuck in, sneakily sandwiching something the voters didn't want between other things that they did. That amendment passed and is what gives us the combined 16-year rule we have now. But it's not the end of the story. Last election cycle, 2018, another citizens petition was approved for the ballot, which would have returned things to the original 6 and 8 rule from 2004 and lowered the combined limit to 10 years. It also included a rule that in the future, term limits could only get on the ballot by way of a citizens petition, not by being referred from the legislature. Polls leading up to the election showed overwhelming support for it, but the amendment was challenged in court, and just over a month before the election, enough of its signatures were ruled invalid based on various technicalities that it was thrown off. The point is, over these 30 years, there has been a consistent pattern of Arkansas voters using petitions to put stronger term limits on the ballot, and our legislators referring amendments, like this year's Issue 2, that would weaken them. Now that you understand what Issue 2 would do and the history of the Arkansas fight over term limits, let's talk about arguments for and against Issue 2, including a more general discussion of arguments for and against term limits. Those in favor of Issue 2 are either against term limits or think the ones we have in Arkansas right now are too harsh. People against term limits often argue that they take away your right to keep a legislator that you like in office. If you've got a representative who has served 2 or 3 terms, but you still think they're doing great work, shouldn't you have the freedom to keep them? A term limit creates a list of people that you're not allowed to vote for, so by enacting term limits, you're giving up some of your own freedom. People against term limits also argue that if a legislator knows their term is limited, they might be more willing to pass bills which have negative long-term consequences, knowing that they won't be around long enough to take the blame. Also, some projects you might want your legislator to undertake could require years of work and planning. Legislators serving their final term might be less ambitious and forward-thinking, knowing that there's no chance they could see certain projects to their end. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, people against term limits point out that one major value of a legislator who has been in office for a while is their accumulated experiences, relationships, and knowledge of the process. This is known as institutional memory, or institutional knowledge, and is not something that can just be handed off to whoever is next elected to the position. If you've ever held a job for a long time, you're probably familiar with this concept. Although someone else might understand the technical requirements of what you do, your accumulated knowledge of the company, the workspace, and the quirks of your coworkers all serve to make you potentially more effective at your job than someone without that experience. People against term limits argue that legislators are the same way. Politicians who've been in office longer understand the ins and outs of how to get things done, and they've already had to establish relationships with General Assembly staff and volunteers, the governor, and other legislators, so they may be able to work more effectively and efficiently as a result. And yes, they may have developed those kinds of relationships with lobbyists and special interests too, but it's important to keep in mind that there are lobbying groups that represent things you probably care about. There are anti-abortion lobbies as well as pro-choice ones. There's coal lobbyists, and there's ones for solar power too. If there's a cause and people willing to pay or donate to support it, there's a lobby ready to take that money and work with politicians on how to use it. And if you're opposed to these kinds of relationships and the effect that money has on politics, keep in mind if legislators are frequently being replaced because of term limits, then lobbyists and special interest groups could become the ones with the most institutional knowledge and might be able to take advantage of less experienced legislators. This potentially gives more power to people you didn't elect. On the other side, people who are in favor of term limits see them as a way to keep the government less corrupt. Ideally, a legislator who is term limited doesn't have as long to develop cozy relationships with lobbyists and special interest groups and might therefore be less likely to be swayed or bribed by them. Term limits also fight what some people see as the problem of incumbent candidates, someone running again for the same position, being far more likely to win. For example, the approval rating for the United States Congress has held fairly low over the last decade, never getting above 40% according to most polls. You'd think such a low approval rating would lead to people voting in new candidates to try and change things, but it doesn't. Incumbents in Congress over the last decade have been re-elected more than 80% of the time. In most elections, incumbents have a huge number of advantages, including name recognition, a record of previous votes to point to, an existing fundraising structure, potentially knowing much earlier than a challenger that they'll be running, and likely not having to run in a primary contest first. And thanks to those existing relationships with donors, lobbyists, and special interest, incumbents are often able to outspend their opponents significantly. People for term limits say these advantages are unfair and make it harder for new voices to break into politics, and many argue that a regular flow of new representatives has some big advantages. New candidates bring in new ideas and are potentially more in touch with the people of their voting district than an incumbent politician who has spent much of their time in the Capitol. So those are some of the arguments for and against term limits. Here are a few more specific to Issue 2 from both sides. Supporters of Issue 2 say that the term limits we have right now in Arkansas are too strict and can force good politicians out of public service while they're still relatively young. In Arkansas, you can run for state representative at the age of 21, or 25 for state senator. If someone runs in their 20s, under the current state limits, they could reach their 16-year lifetime limit as early as age 37. Knowing that starting early means ending early might keep younger candidates with fresh ideas from running in the first place. Finally, supporters of Issue 2 say that by limiting consecutive years, this amendment fights the problem of incumbency without being too limiting in other aspects. That way, if there's a truly great representative, they could serve a few terms, take some time off, and then run again later. If they win without the advantage of incumbency, proponents argue it only makes sense to give them the chance to serve up to 12 years in a row again. Those against Issue 2 point to the history of back and forth on Arkansas term limits and see this as yet another example of politicians trying to push term limit laws that benefit them but go against the will of the people. They say that the overwhelming support for the stronger 2018 proposed term limits show that Arkansans want more restrictions, not less. Some also argue that the ballot title itself is deceptive. Calling something a term limits amendment when it's really making them less limiting could cause some voters who don't do their research ahead of time to vote for the opposite of what they want. Those against issue 2 might also say that 2 or 4 years out of office isn't long enough to break many of the insider relationships which contribute to the perceived problem of incumbency, nor is it long enough to break an effective monopoly on a single seat. Someone elected this year, since they'd start under the old rules, could serve for 16 years, take 4 off, then serve another 12, leaving them in office for 28 of the next 32 years. And even those representatives entirely governed by the new rules could either serve 12 on and 4 off, or 10 on and 2 off, over and over again for as long as they were able to get elected. If your goal is not just to avoid the advantages of incumbency, but to eliminate the possibility of the same people holding the same seats for an extended period of time, Amendment 2 doesn't do it. Finally, those opposed to Issue 2 might also point to what's happening this year with Issue 3 and the interplay between them. Issue 3, if passed, would make it harder to get constitutional amendments on the ballot. An amendment from the legislature would need more votes, and an amendment from the citizens would have stricter rules for signatures. See our video on Issue 3 for details. If we were operating under the rules of Issue 3 right now, Issue 2 would not have made it to the ballot. Issue 3 would require a 60% vote in the Arkansas House and Senate to refer a constitutional amendment, but Issue 2 only passed in the House with 51%. It's potentially hypocritical for the legislature to send Issue 2 to the ballot while also arguing the process they used to pass it is too easy. And constitutional amendments are the only way to change General Assembly term limits. So if Issue 3 passes, changing term limits would become more difficult. Opponents of Issue 2 say that this is a power grab. Legislators going for a 1-2 punch of removing a restriction voters placed on them and making it harder for voters to place restrictions on them in the future. So now that you know the arguments, let's talk about how you might want to vote on Issue 2. Generally speaking, if you're against term limits, or just think the ones in Arkansas are too strict, or if you think it's a good middle ground to force legislators to take time away from office without limiting the total time they can serve, then you'll want to vote for Issue 2. On the other hand, if you're in favor of term limits or just don't want to change the ones we have now, or if you think switching from a cumulative maximum to a limit on consecutive years would do more harm than good, or if you're against the state legislature trying to get rid of restrictions that voters placed on them, then you'll want to vote against Issue 2. And that's it! Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you can join us on more explorations of Arkansas politics and history. And if you want to help us create more videos like this, consider donating to ArkanSense on Patreon. Patreon is the easiest way to support content makers in a way that works for your budget. You decide how much you want to give each month and you can change that amount at any time. Bigger donations get bigger perks, including picking a topic for an upcoming episode. And speaking of perks, thanks to patrons Zach Green, Jordan Little, Zach Clark, Alan Archer, and W. Don Hughes, as well as everyone else on screen now for making this video happen. Thanks again, and see you next time for more ArkanSense.